They're submitting those reimbursements, and then my programs division, management analysts looking at it, making some determinations, emailing them for additional documentations that may be necessary, and then sending it over to my fiscal office and our financial analysts looking at it from a different perspective, looking for other information that may be missing, asking the program side to now contact again the project sponsors and let them know these items were missing, and then sending it over to OGA, who looks at it from yet a different perspective, identifies maybe some things that are yet missing, and goes back to programs to say contact these agencies again and tell them this is missing. You can imagine how frustrating that has been. What we are doing effective April 1 is fiscal will do the entire review for the Department of Grants and Community Development. That reduces the number of hands that have to touch each reimbursement and how many steps within the department the reimbursements must go through. Now, we have to send it to OGA because they have a different set of obligations, but by the time it gets to OGA, they should have everything in place. At the time that the project sponsors submit their reimbursements, we've attached the checklist that says these items must be included, and then they attest at the bottom that the items are included and that the items included are accurate so that we are less likely to have to hold up the process. I mentioned earlier the number of the iterations that we've had, which is back and forth before we can actually start the time clock running on reimbursing and paying. The goal is to reduce that and to pay all of these reimbursements within 30 days. It's beneficial to our project sponsors, it's extremely beneficial to our residents, but it's also beneficial to the city because this allows us to draw down our funds, pay ourselves back those federal funds into our general funds and not owe ourselves $9 million. We are working on contract management. Reimbursements and contract management go hand in hand. And while the focus is often on our delayed reimbursements, project sponsors will share with you that they are equally frustrated with the contracting process. Our contracting process is also tedious. And to the extent that the department can streamline its role, we are doing that. By removing reimbursements responsibilities from program operations and putting it entirely in fiscal operations, it frees up the management analysts to focus on contract management, the amounts of the contract, the due dates, the eligibility, the timeline, making sure that as soon as we've received council approval to proceed on how funds will be awarded, we start collecting those documents, and then we get the PO as quickly as we can so that we can get the signatures routed, and then we can start routing. Everything is connected. And I also must share that we've been very understaffed in that area, but again, by removing some of the responsibilities, we can better utilize the staff we have as we continue to onboard additional staff. I suspect that our project sponsors will see the impact of these changes in the next NOFA process. Each previous year, contracts have been delayed 3 months for some, 6 months for some, and even up to a year for others. And so we're expediting this process, but they will not see that impact immediately because we still have to catch up on the contracts that are delayed even now as we speak. So I pride myself on being transparent with our project sponsors, and so it's important that they know the impact is coming, but it's going to be a little bit more delayed. And I mentioned our staffing concerns and how we've been working on that internally. Lastly, we received notice just last week that Congress passed a $1.5 trillion budget that funds HOPWA at $450 million, not what's been advocated for and certainly not what would be most beneficial for the city of Atlanta. So we were expecting this. It's HOPWA modernization. It is upon us. And internally, we have been preparing as a department. We've also been communicating with the mayor's office. COO Gordon has shared some plans and next steps that we plan on implementing as soon as feasible, but we're also doing what we can now, reprogramming funds to permanent supportive housing. It's permanent supportive housing that we can keep affordable, and we will support our project sponsors in that regard. We're also engaging in conversations about next steps and how to best prepare for that impact, because the city of Atlanta will have a $9 million reduction in its next HOPWA allocation, and that will in fact be felt by our project sponsors and by our residents. And that concludes my presentation, and I will answer your questions as best as I can.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Wan. And before I give the floor over to my colleagues to ask questions, I do want to acknowledge Councilmember Waits, who did arrive to join us today. And so with that being said, colleagues, if you have questions, please let me know. Councilmember Bakhtiari.
First, thank you for your presentation. First question is, why the $9 million reduction?
HOPWA modernization is not necessarily within our control, so Congress has determined that funds will shift from various grantees to other grantees, and the City of Atlanta has, for really the life of HOPWA, received more than most jurisdictions. In fact, for the past 3 years, we've received more as a grantee than any other city of our size. And as a matter of fact, last year, the only entity that received more than we did was the state of New York. So Congress has just determined that they are going to shift funds, and there was a calculation in place that we had no say in, and the determination was a $9 million reduction.
I'll have more questions later, but I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Councilmember Wan.
Go ahead, Councilmember Wan.
All right, here we go. So, Commissioner, I'm going to say I appreciate all the great work that you've done since you've been here. I realize you are the messenger, so you're going to feel the brunt of everything, and I hope you will receive it in a constructive way and then figure out who on the team and which department is best positioned to effectuate this. I can't sit next to her anymore. I was just going to tell everybody. So I don't even know where to start. So I think I may just go slide by slide that I've written down questions. In slide 3, when you break out the schedule from year to year, I appreciate the explanation about what we are awarded, what we still have to draw down. But what's missing in this to me is what is not committed in terms of, from FY18, what we know our service providers have expended and what we are obligated, and what's still the balances and what may be at risk. So I think to the extent that someone can go and add that information in, I think it'll be very informative for us. The other thing that troubles me about this one, though, is that what I haven't seen, also just an explanation of the life cycle of a grant, an award from, like, for example, the FY18 funds. We received notice from the federal government, from HUD, that we've received $23 million. And then we enter into a process by which we put an RFP out for service providers to come propose to us. Then we evaluate them, we award, and then we go to contracting. And then from contracting, that they start their work, they submit reimbursement requests. We work our way through that, and then we reimburse, and then we finally turn it back around and ask the federal government for funds. If I'm looking at your later schedules correctly, I mean, we're talking about a several-year process. Some of the grants I'm seeing that you're just reimbursing this year were submitted in 2020. So I think it'll be helpful to understand and map out what that timeline looks like, because then I think we'll see where the giant gaps are. Like, I think there's a giant gap between when the decisions are made of who to award and the contract. That's a long period of time from my experience when I was at Jerusalem House. And then after that, the next gap is reimbursement request to actual payout. Both of those cause so much hardship for our service providers, because, as you said, it's a reimbursement grant. We're expecting them to pay the money out first before they can come back and ask us for the money. And then we hold the funds and are remitting that to them for some time. So again, I think having that breakout and just a very honest conversation about what the timeline looked like for each one of the 4 fiscal years that you've mentioned, I think will illuminate even more where the gaps are. So if that's something your team can go back and provide, I would appreciate that. All right, so now I'm going to start asking some of the questions here. Yeah,
may I, Council Chair?
Yep.
I will just provide a brief response, and then we will gladly follow up in writing. The risk of funds to be recaptured is at 0.
Okay.
And we would not have been able to say that before. We have, in fact, suffered recapture with HOPWA in the past, and it was painful. However, FY18 funds will be drawn down by April 30th, and zero will be recaptured. And none of the remaining funds on this slide are in jeopardy of recapture right now, and the goal is to keep it that way, hence the change in the processes that I've outlined. And as far as the cycle, you're correct. There have been gaps, there have been lulls, there have been just outright funds just sitting there between the NOFA process, the contracting, and the reimbursements. And that's why we're sure to touch upon those three things. We're changing the NOFA process so that once we know how much we're being awarded, we move more swiftly and we educate better. And we make sure that we support our project sponsors in a way that they've relayed to us, not just how we think it would be better. For contracting, that delay has in fact been impactful because for some fiscal year contracts, project sponsors got the contract a couple of months before it would actually have expired. The funds themselves didn't expire, but the timeline was skewed. And so now we're trying to realign the timelines so that for FY 22, 23 and onward, they can be back on track and they can actually get their contracts in a reasonable period of time. Hence, removing some of the lull and the gag was because, honestly, of capacity. And then you also asked about the funding and how things move from one point to another. All of it is correlated, but none of the funds are in jeopardy right now. And once these reimbursements are caught up by June 30th, we will have a few that, in fact, were not fully submitted. We can't pay reimbursements that we can't justify. That's going to be difficult for some of our project sponsors. But the majority of our reimbursements for project sponsors will now be on track. Be effective the new calendar year. So we'll still draw this out for you, but I wanted to be sure you understood. And then lastly, one additional comment that may assist is FY18 funds had to be drawn down really by the end of 21, or by April of 21, and then actually the end of 21, I'm sorry, and we got an extension. When things are operating as they should, 1/3 of FY18 funds would have been fully expended in 18. Another third would have been fully expended in 19, and then 20, and we would have been okay. And so now that we're catching up, we can do that for 2021 going forward, but we've communicated this with HUD, and HUD has certainly communicated its expectations to us, and we finally have a plan in place that brings us up to date.
Okay. I appreciate that additional information. You know, I guess once you have kind of the new processes in place, it'd be good to revisit this because, you know, again, those gaps are critical in terms of decisions that our service providers have to make in terms of continuity of service to their current clients and baking that in terms of new programs or continuing on old programs. And then again, just the carrying cost of having to expend the funds first and then the long time it takes to get reimbursed. And am I correct to assume that we still can't pay or don't pay interest on outstanding payment to invoices
You're correct.
for however long it takes us to pay, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so our expectation is that either the service provider has the financial capacity to front that for, in some cases, up to 2 years, or have the ability to borrow it and then just bear the interest costs. And that eats into their ability to provide services as well, correct?
You're correct. Yes, sir.
Okay. Kind of continuing on, understanding that you have been understaffed, doesn't the city, however, or the program, does the city receive administration fees or fees to cover our costs to process the program?
We do. Yes, sir.
Can you give me an idea of the annual magnitude of the dollar amount, please?
We can take 10%. 6% of HOPWA. I'm sorry, 6%. Correct, Felicia? Thank you. We can take 6% of the total allocation, and that's for staffing for the majority of it, both the staffing in our department and the limited staffing that OGA is able to allocate to us. And the same applies to our project sponsors. They can allocate or set aside a percentage of the funds that we award them for administrative purposes.
So using that calculation, FY18, $23 million, 6% of that is roughly what, 1.5 million that we've received? So do we track how that we've spent that? I mean, you said we've been understaffed.
Yes.
One of my big things are, vacant positions that we fund that we don't actually incur those costs. Are we tracking that?
We must track.
Okay.
We must report that to HUD. So whether the city tracks or not, and we do, we must report that to HUD. And we also stand to lose those funds where vacant positions aren't filled because administrative funds are attached to the same timeline that the balance of the funds are attached to. So admin funds expire also.
Okay. Have we considered contract help to help us clear out the backlog? I mean, even if that's an expense that the city incurs that isn't reimbursable by HOPWA, is that something you've explored?
Yes, sir. We have contract help in place right now.
Okay. And would committing extra resources to that even further accelerate the backlog that we have, even through what you're projecting to pay out by June 30th? And the reason why I ask is, again, if you look at the invoice dates on these and they extend back a year or more, again, I keep harping on the hardship that we are imposing on our partners. I mean, that we should treat them as partners. So I don't know if that would help accelerate that, and if so, if that's something you would consider quantifying so that we as a policy-making body can consider whether we think that's a worthwhile investment to make.
Yes, sir. It would certainly be helpful, and we do consider our project sponsors partners. And the mayor's office has already started engaging in those conversations with our department so that we don't create a new set of backlog once we catch up.
Okay. So I'll ask you, if you will, just if to think about that, and if it would help to add X number of FTEs over the next 30 to 90 days to help clear, make sure that we clear all this out or even accelerate. You said you're going to make some of the payments well in advance of the I think April 1st deadline that you mentioned, and I think we got to look at every means possible to get this cleared out. Because what I'd like to do is, by doing that, then come July 1st, we get to reset the clock completely. You get to put all of your new programs and designs and systems in place, and we start rocking and rolling from that point on. Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned a July pivot to in-person monitoring. It sounds like that's kind of a magic date that hopefully the backlog's cleared out and we can start fresh with your new design program, correct?
Yes, sir. And it's a key day internally for the mayor's office, but also for HUD, because we have some deadlines that we shall meet with them.
Okay. The last thing I'll say is, I think one of the biggest alarm bells that went up was when Positive Impact elected to withdraw from the program. It was concerning on a lot of fronts. I mean, because of the size, and the valuable service they provide. But what struck me today even more so was your comment about part of the issue sometimes are service providers that aren't as sophisticated, aren't as seasoned, and don't understand the reimbursement and contracting process. I get that, but when we're losing ones that are, in theory, seasoned and understand the process and probably are getting other HOPWA grants from other agencies, there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect there. So what happened there? I mean, is it worth at least focusing on as we go forward, really focusing on the seasoned providers so that we can, I'm trying to figure out how I want to say this, so we can ensure that the programs are running smoothly and then allow you some bandwidth capacity to focus on bringing on new ones. To me, it'd be a different calculus if all of a sudden we brought on 20 brand new service providers that are not familiar with this, because that's a pretty big lift, versus, okay, X provider is tried and true. They know what they're doing, and we can rely on them to not only perform the services, but do all the administrative pieces of it as well.
Yes, sir. We don't want to lose any other service providers, small or large. And while we welcome adding capacity and helping new entities become HOPWA project sponsors, it is vitally important that we keep the ones we have. For every project sponsor lost, those are people who are going to be displaced. Yep. And it was a challenge and remains a challenge. Positive Impact, of course, released its statement from its perspective, and respectfully, we will acknowledge that it took too long to pay projects, Positive Impact. It took entirely too long to pay them. It's taken too long to pay many of our project sponsors. I will say that that was a key concern for that particular entity. There are some other concerns, and it's important to us that we implement the plan I've laid out to you so that we don't lose any more project sponsors, that we pay them quickly and they can continue providing their services. We don't want 20 new HOPWA project sponsors because there's a lot of work that goes into being a service provider under any of our entitlement programs, but particularly HOPWA. It is a different beast in itself, and it's not an entitlement program that many cities have. So you're correct. It's a loss that we still feel, and we're working very diligently to make sure we focus on the smallest project sponsor who feel the pain of every dollar even more, and the largest, up to the largest project sponsors who serve so many of our residents. So that is an acknowledged position, and we're working on it and remain committed to it.
I mean, again, I'll close by saying, Commissioner, I appreciate all the progress you've made. Again, you're just the messenger today, and you're going to receive the brunt of the frustration that we're feeling and receiving on our side as well. If there's one message that you leave with today from me, is that this council member stands ready to provide. I think it's a resource. It sounds like a resource and then actual implementation challenge right now. And if I feel like the resource piece, even if it's outside help, there are plenty of people out there that can help us on this, then you just need to raise your hand and ask, and let us figure out how we can advocate for you and appeal to the administration to provide that resource to you. So I look forward to, I'm hoping that, when we reconvene 4 months from now to talk about this and you've got your new systems in place, it's going to be a really good story. So thank you.
It will, yes, sir. And I will say, Councilmember Warren, that you pitched the delivery to this messenger way softer than the project sponsors did. So I am grateful for that.
Thank you, Councilman Warren. I do know that Councilman Bakhtiari has another question, but before we go, I just want to see if any of my other colleagues want to ask. Okay. Okay, Councilman Bakhtiari, and then we'll go to Council President Shipman, and then we'll go to Councilman Waits.
Just another short question. Since it's hard to follow up, Councilmember Juan, who pretty much took a majority of mine. One of the questions I had was, I know that a lot of the providers still feel a level of disconnect, and I'm wondering when the city will be providing another training on what is actually required, because I know some of the providers do not feel that they still don't feel that they understand what is required to qualify or to apply or anything, or for reimbursement. So I'm wondering, why hasn't something been scheduled, and when will something be scheduled?
Specific to our NOFA process for those who wish to become project sponsors?
Well, that, and also for current providers who are still struggling with the process and trying to.
Yes, ma'am. We just had a session last week, and honestly, today's only Tuesday, so yes, last week, it was our second of our quarterly project sponsor updates. Those updates are now mirroring CPD's All Grantees meeting for recipients. And the purpose of that is twofold. One, to provide updates on changes within the city and the department. For example, they did not need to hear that we're changing the reimbursement process from you all. With all due respect, I appreciate your helping to spread the news, but they needed to hear it from us. So we had that meeting. It also allows us to provide training from them, as requested from them. So they stated to us that the monitoring-based approach was still a little confusing, and we addressed a little bit of that, and we put information on the website, and we emailed. And between now and the next meeting, which is already scheduled for June 10th, they'll send us information that they desire to receive training on, and we will provide a presentation and email something in writing to them about those specific topics. That's new, but it's geared to meet whatever they've identified as real issues for those who are hands-on. That's for HOPWA and all of our other service providers, but we're separating them by grants. And as for the NOFA process, for those who are not already providing services, that's the educational component that I mentioned earlier. So instead of just releasing the funds and saying, read these regs, and I hope you understand, and that you submit an appropriate application, we're going to provide education on the front end, and we're going to provide technical assistance during the application period. And those funds have not yet been released. In the past, council member, we would engage in our NOFA process and not even know how much we're going to get till 3, 4, 5 months later. And so we are preparing now to start the NOFA process in March, and we've also shared that information with our service providers.
And you said that began last week?
Ma'am?
You said the emails, you said the training, the new
Yes.
changes began.
The second quarterly training was last week, and we followed up with the presentation in writing, and we emailed it to every single project sponsor and all of those who were on the call. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Bakhtiari. Council President Shipman.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate my appreciation for you coming and sharing and all the work that's been done. I have questions on a number of different topics, so I'm going to jump around a bit. On the modernization impact, do we know in percentage terms roughly what that means? You know, is it 70% of what's been funded before, 50%? What's the rough impact generally to the program?
About 40%. And Jeff? Yes, Jeff is our expert, Mr. Graham. It's about 40% of what our average has been for the past 3 or 4 years and what we can anticipate in the next allocation.
So it's a major reduction.
It's a major
to say the least. But as you've said, it sort of filters in over 3 years because of the way that the cycle goes.
Well, we do still have the funding that was on one of these slides, and it's the next allocation that will be impacted. And it's not firm yet. We are just preparing and anticipating that these numbers that have been shared with us are in fact what we'll receive. The advocates may still be successful in other realms, and it also isn't necessarily every year thereafter, but we just want to live in the reality that this may be ongoing.
There's been a significant list of approved yet unfunded people who want to participate in the program, who haven't been able to participate in the program. Whose responsibility is it, in your opinion, to clear out the backlog of those who have been approved but have not yet received funding?
It's all of ours. And I want to make sure I understand the question, sir. We have a list of people who are awaiting services specific to housing.
Correct.
And the housing pool just doesn't exist. It is all of our responsibilities. It is the cities, including my department specifically. It's our project sponsors and then others to collectively work on ways to collaborate and increase that pool. Hence, our department going in and reallocating funds to permanent supportive housing. That's where we have the most control in keeping units affordable and building affordable units. So my perspective is that it's a shared responsibility, but for the funds that we have in this department, we're targeting in on that particular area.
Okay. I want to follow up on Councilmember Wan's question. Whose responsibility is it to manage the relationships with the providers?
It would be the Department of Grants and Community Development as it relates to reimbursements, funding, and contracting.
So I think my question is, to follow up on his question, are there part of your plan did not outline how to recover relationships that have been damaged, for lack of a better term? How can we recover those relationships? And is there a possibility that we can bring some folks back into the fold, especially the larger providers that do have a lot of the sophistication? I mean, is that on the radar screen, or do you think that those relationships are not recoverable?
Oh, no, I'm an optimist. I think there's always hope. I think one of the first things we have to do is show them that things are different, because I cannot ask you to come back to the same mess you left. And for the sponsors who've left, and even some who were contemplating leaving, I don't think that was an easy decision. I don't think it's an easy process for them, because they're committed to this work. And unfortunately, when they leave the city, but they don't leave the work. So that means the commitment remains just outside of the services that benefit our residents. When I started, I spent the first 35 or 40 days calling service providers individually. It's what I meant when I told Chairman Wan that he delivered it softer than many others, because the same spiel I was giving they'd heard before, and they did not believe me. They were not inclined to believe me. And so time has shown for some that the change is real, but just in the past 3 months, we've received so many positive comments about real change that's in place. It's late, but it's not too late for the project sponsors we still have. So yes, I personally remain committed to conversing with them as often and as necessary, but my team is also being restructured so that that accountability lies with each of us individually, so that collectively we're meeting these needs and we're delivering the same message and high quality customer service. I can't say that we've always done that, but we're doing better now, and we're committed to doing even better. So, yes, sir.
Thank you. Do you feel confident that you have their list of things that need to change for them to consider coming back? I mean, could you make a slide that says these are the seven themes that providers always bring up? I mean, is it that clear?
It is that clear. And if it were not before, we recently started engaging Jennifer Keenan with our project sponsors, and they certainly shared with her their concerns, and she has since shared. Nothing on that list was new, and we'll continue to work on it. So, yes, sir.
Okay. You talked a bit about staffing. Could you just, I'm sorry if I missed it in the presentation, but how many staff do you currently have, and how many staff do you have budgeted for?
When fully funded, we would be at 52. We are at 39 on board right now, but we were just informed this week that we'll be permitted to post for other key positions that are not yet funded. But the mayor's office is working to fund those positions as they also understand the importance of filling all of these positions. Specific to HOPWA, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 positions. No, I'm sorry. Specific to HOPWA is just 2 positions that are vacant. But the program operations office that houses HOPWA has 6 positions, but 2 are HOPWA.
So, sorry, just on the HOPWA one, how many positions specifically do you have for HOPWA and how many are vacant?
I have 5 positions for HOPWA. 2 of those 5 positions are vacant, but keep in mind we have contracted assistance. So while we're still looking to become fully staffed in HOPWA, we have the third-party contractor that's helping us process reimbursements, and that's been a significant help.
And then you mentioned the relationship between your office and OGA. If you were fully staffed, is there still going to be a bottleneck with OGA? Is that another area that we should be asking questions about their staffing levels and their timing? I mean, it's one thing to get you fully staffed and up and running, but if there's a bottleneck there, it may lead to the same outcomes.
So we've actually had those discussions internally between my department and finance and OGA, and the CFO has committed to addressing the staffing shortage on the OGA side and has actually, I believe, funded or provided the funding for additional positions. Because you're correct. If we've got, and I need to correct myself, it's 6 HOPWA positions in my programs office. There are another 3 HOPWA positions in the fiscal office and another 3 HOPWA positions in compliance. But right now it's programs that initially takes in the work. But to take 9 to 10 people doing HOPWA work in my department and send them all to 1 or 2 people in OGA is not realistic. And the CFO, the comptroller, deputy comptroller are already working on making sure that there is no bottleneck going forward.
You mentioned the management software RFP that's coming out. Roughly, how much do you anticipate that that's going to cost?
What we pay right now is about $1 million over 3 years. I anticipate that we'll probably, well, I'm afraid to say how much I anticipate because they might be watching and they might put it in their RFP proposals. But I do anticipate that it's going to be more than $1 million.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
That's fine. And what kind of time frame do you think on implementation that's realistic? I mean, just walk us through, if you're releasing the RFP soon, where's the actual implementation?
We will release the RFP the first week of April, and we have asked for presentations from companies that do this kind of work. So we've had some presentations. When we release the RFPs, we will be sure to contact those who've presented to us to make sure they know. We'll leave it open for 30 days, and so that puts us second week in May, and then implementation by the end of July, because I know that's fairly quick, but I think it's feasible because these programs can be built out fairly quickly. And luckily, I have staff who are familiar with how these programs should be built out. So end of July for implementation of our new program management software.
Somewhat related, one of the issues that a lot of providers have brought up to me is that they feel like that over time, the specific requirements asked of them change as staff members change, or the small policy change happens and some staff members know and some staff members don't, and all of a sudden they're filling out forms the way that somebody 6 months ago told them, and by the time they land, the things have changed. Is the IT system going to change that, or is that primarily a management issue that you're trying to work through, or both?
It's both. It's both. Human error, but the IT system, this new program, at least what we've seen out there versus what we're using now, will capture and mitigate some of that human error. But when you asked if I could get a list and include project sponsors' concerns, that would be top 3 for sure, is that the end continues to shift. As much as we're providing quarterly training for our project sponsors, we're providing monthly training internally. And we've got SOPs that everyone must not only read, acknowledge, and implement, but then they have to sign. It's an accountability portion that says, I'm aware of this new process, I know what to relay and what to message to our service providers.
A specific question that also providers have brought up is the inability to submit multiple invoices. That in the past there's been you can't submit July until June is cleared, and obviously given the timeline that you talked about, that means that we just stack up a number of invoices that haven't even been submitted from providers. Is that still the policy, and if not, what's the current policy around submittal of invoices?
It should never have been the policy, but in fact we were messaging that, and I have said myself on every meeting we've had, that is not our policy. Please do not do that. If anyone on my team asks you to hold reimbursements, email me directly. We are asking them to submit their reimbursements as soon as the period ends and they have it prepared. And we have that in writing too.
And do you feel like that most of those have been submitted now, that the providers have in fact changed, or do you feel like that, if we look at your numbers and what we know and what you're trying to pay against, which I appreciate, but do we have a clear sense of the invoices outstanding, or do you think there's still a backlog of unsubmitted invoices?
Well, there's a backlog of unsubmitted because it's important that we understand, and I relay this as sensitively as I can, we will own and acknowledge our shortcomings within the department, but that same turnover and the same access to capacity applies to our project sponsors. And some of them have 6, 7, 8 months of reimbursements that they have not submitted, not reimbursements that were submitted and we sent back, but reimbursements that we have not yet received, which is why the caveat for the April 1 deadline and the June 30th deadlines were, these are reimbursements that we have received in their full and complete forms. But we do still have a backlog, not nearly as significant as this backlog, but there are some.
Just 2 final questions. One is, what, if any, relationship is there with the Atlanta housing, especially back to the comment about trying to find supply of affordable housing? Is there a formal, informal relationship, not really a relationship right now between this program and Atlanta housing, in your opinion?
There's a relationship, but Atlanta Housing Authority operates slightly different from how we do, but there is a formal relationship, and they are constantly willing to take funds that we need to expend, and we know that they do expend those funds properly, but there's an open line of communication and a regular line of communication to Atlanta Housing Authority.
And final question, and many providers have raised it, so I think it's a question that has to be asked. Would we be better off basically having a third party manage this instead of doing it internally? Obviously there's a lot of investment in human capital. There's investment in technology coming up. There's a lot to manage here. Is it a better strategy to simply find another entity to manage this for us?
So I've thought about that, and I've thought about it as objectively as I could, because the goal has to be our residents. And what I've experienced here in my year and 4 months is, even when we bring on third parties, the time it takes to get them acclimated to our systems, to make sure they understand where we are, and where we are is abnormal, and to make sure they understand where all this information they need, they would have charged in their hourly billable rates almost $1 million before they could even get started in doing the reimbursements. Even with Landmark, who is currently doing our reimbursements, the third party that's processing reimbursements, it took a while for them to be able to be just brought up to speed on what the processes are. So my objective and firm, and I believe well-informed answer is, I don't think we would be better off outsourcing HOPWA. I think with the new processes we have implemented, with the support and the additional resources we've received and the additional resources that I know you all are committed to providing, if necessary, we are well on our way to operating this program the way it should have been operated. And I do ask for just a little bit more grace to show you that this is not a temporary fix, but a long-term fix.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Dozier, for the time.
Thank you, Council President. Before we go to Councilmember Waits, I do want to let the public or the folks in the room know, I know a couple of people have signed up for public comment. There will be a public comment period after this initial Q&A. I'm going to leave the sign-in sheet back at the front where it was earlier, so if you still would like to say something after we get done with the Q&A, please sign in and we'll acknowledge you. But just wanted to let y'all know that piece. All right, Councilmember Waits.
Commissioner, thank you for your presentation this morning. A couple of questions. I wanted to know, have you taken a look to see what other comparable cities are doing? I know you referenced New York, and I'm thinking probably something like a D.C. and maybe even San Francisco, but have you taken a look to see what those other cities are doing in relationship to their management of their HOPWA funds?
Yes, ma'am. I reached out, actually. I tried to find comparable cities and to find out some of the processes they've implemented. For example, early on here, when I first arrived, I could not understand why our reimbursements were so voluminous and what we were requiring that others were not. I had a lot of questions about how we were operating and how we could mirror those grantees who were more efficient. So yes, ma'am, I have reached out. I started with Georgia grantees, but they're so much smaller than we are that it was important to reach out to some Florida neighbors and get some information. So yes, and we've implemented some of what we've learned. But I also want to stress that CPD, our local HUD office, is a real resource, and they also provide us access to how to change our procedures.
Okay. Also, I looked at the invoice. I noticed that out of the 11, I'm on page 4, most of these were under $50,000. Is there a metrics or a system that you utilize? Because my thought process, is there any way that we can expedite payments that are under the range of $50,000? Of the 11, 6 of them fall into that category, and right up under there's another 3 below here that are under $10,000. So my thought process is, we're talking about such a small amount of money in terms of the $10,000 ratio. Is there any way, given your approval or authority, that we could expedite those, given that they're such small payments?
I wish. The difference between regular non-HUD reimbursements and HUD reimbursements is why I think it's so important to help build capacity. Whether it's $10,000 or $100,000 or $500,000, we still have to identify key supporting documentation. And sometimes the smaller agencies maybe overlook, or something happens along the way, so we send it back and send it back and send it back until we have it. And those are the types of things we're trying to streamline. If you know what you must submit, and we make it clear to you that we're not coming back to ask for anything else, whether it's $10,000 or $100,000, the process will just be smoother. But there is no way for me to say, because it's less than 50 or less than 25, let's pay these within 24 hours. We have to go through the same process.
And you said these are HUD guidelines.
These are HUD guidelines as far as what must be submitted, and the specifics and the specificity depends on the programs and then depends on us. We have truly tried to streamline what we're asking for to line up with only what HUD requires, so that when my department is done and it goes over to OGA, we're all on the same page.
Okay. I don't want to delay the process. I'd love to hear the public comments. Just one last thought. So we're dealing with a vulnerable population of people. I know that there was some conversations surrounding 250 individuals who were impacted by this particular conversation. So my thought is similar to all of those that have asked questions, and while we're all here today, is to simply figure out how we can get the resources to the people that we care about the most. How do we incentivize housing providers to join the program? Is this something that the city can do through a subsidy or a tax credit? What is your recommendation for that?
We actually just had a portion of this conversation with Mr. Graham and some other HOPWA advocates this week. There are things that other grantees are doing, and we just need to find the funds, or maybe allocate specific amounts of funding for those types of incentives. Many of them are approved by HUD. Others would require non-federal funds for us to be able to focus on that. So we are having those discussions, but we also need to be sure that as we have those discussions, we have commitment, both financially and commitment from the project sponsors, to utilize the incentives and remain engaged, and to also help us attract additional project sponsors. So yes, ma'am, that is a topic that we are considering and looking forward to acting upon.
Finally, Mr. Chair, of the overwhelming majority of the providers, are they within the City of Atlanta spectrum or within the 285 corridor? And if so, if not, have we considered going outside of Metro Atlanta to provide those services?
So HOPWA, unlike our other entitlement programs, permits us to go outside Atlanta. Housing is not affordable in the City of Atlanta. So we've got 29 counties that we work within or that our project sponsors are able to work within. So again, some are operating in DeKalb and Clayton and Fulton as well as the City of Atlanta, and some may focus on specific areas, but that is permissible.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Councilmember Waits. Up next, we'll have Councilmember Bakhtiari, then Councilmember Westmoreland.
Another question that occurred to me, and I want to preface this by saying that this is not solely your responsibility by any means, but my biggest concern in all of this is that this conversation, this work session will end up being ineffective because we will not have providers coming back to the table to apply because the process has been as, I don't want to say problematic, as exhaustive as it's been, that we've had this backlog, that we've had these issues, because what I'm hearing from providers over and over again, because I've gone out to visit some of the sites where they're building housing or where they've attempted to work with our grants department to get funding. There's been such a backlog is that they say they're not coming back to the table after this project is completed because they do not see a point anymore. So my question is, how can we as council work with grants? Have you thought about how we can, because this is our responsibility to share with you, have you thought about how we can bring our providers back to the table to reinstate faith and trust and build back that faith that we can actually get this work done, that they should work with us, that we are here to support them to provide these funds so that we can begin providing and advocating for our most vulnerable populations? Because right now, they don't have faith.
Yes, ma'am. When I listen to public comment or I read the emails, because I read all of them, what I think you all can do and what the public has asked for is to hold us accountable. I think if they believe that we are answering to more than just ourselves, because some of them think we have free will to just decide who we're going to pay and who we're not going to pay. That's how they feel based on how quickly or slowly they've received payment. And in requesting this presentation today and in announcing that you want another in 4 months, I think that level of accountability will let them know this is not an opportunity for the commissioner to come up, make promises, or make anyone feel good, and then we just sweep it under the rug. So that level of accountability I'm committed to, my team is committed to, I know the CFO is committed to it, and if I know that when I come back before you, you'll remember what I presented today, that's not the only reason, but surely the goal would be to make sure we have better news for you. We have to have better news for the current project sponsors to encourage them to stay and also to attract more. I think accountability is key.
I think it also might be incumbent upon us as this group and as council to also, and as the commissioner, to reach out to some of our providers that feel as though we have let them down or they have lost faith to bring them back to the table to re-engage them. And I look forward to discussing that with you after this to find out how we can make sure we meet them where they are and bring them back to the table rather than expecting them to come back after having seen what we're trying to do here.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Councilmember Bakhtiari. Councilmember Westmoreland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just two quick comments. One, I want to co-sign on the comments that Councilmember Wan made earlier about if there are, dollars that we feel we need to allocate to expedite even more between now and June 30th, or as you look to the next fiscal year, ensure that we don't ever get into this backlog again. I think there's pretty clear interest in that from at least the people who are here right now and probably some folks who aren't. And second, I've been here for the last 16 months, and then I was here for 35 months before that. And two things. One, whether it's Jeff Graham or Emily Brown back in 2019 and 2020, the work that we were receiving incredible cry-outs from folks who were working with an incredibly broken system. And I have seen a pretty meaningful shift over the last 16 months. And so I just wanted to say thank you for the work that you and your team are doing. I know we've just spent the last 90 minutes talking about how much more work there is to go, but thank you for what you've done and what you are doing every single day, and know that we will do whatever we need to do, whether it's the accountability that Liliana just mentioned or additional dollars to help keep making progress.
Thank you, Councilmember Westmoreland. May I make a correction?
Yes, absolutely.
We have been fully ingrained in HOPWA CV funds, the coronavirus funding we've received. And I know the project sponsors watching have probably already emailed me. Our HOPWA admin portion is 6% for CV. It's typically 3%. So I don't want them to think that they too can utilize additional portions for administrative needs. So I wanted to make that correction on the record.
Thank you so much. Any final questions from my colleagues? I will ask just one question because,
Yes,
as chair of Community Development Human Service Committee, I always let my colleagues go first, and then by the time it comes back to me, usually I don't have any remaining questions. But I do want to ask, I know there is some concern about risk of losing funding, such as HOPWA, not just HOPWA, but I know some other programs there have been conversations about some of our supportive housing programs and things like that. How does your office feel in terms of if that risk still remains? Are the measures that you have taken in place something that's been well received by HUD and some of our other federal partners? I just want to get a sense of I know we've gone through a lot of reform, but has that been reflected by some of the federal partners who have expressed concerns about how we've managed them in the past?
Yes, sir. Deputy Assistant Secretary Byron was here in person 2 weeks ago to meet with us, and she shared her I might say delight, so I'm not sure she would say delight, but she was pleased that we'd made such significant progress. But she also outlined steps that are expected of us. And one thing I can assure you is the City of Atlanta is not in jeopardy of losing any additional HOPWA funds. We are not. Now, we're working on other entitlement programs and making sure we're just as secure there as we've gotten with HOPWA, but we are not at risk of losing any of the 18 funds, 19, 20, 21, 22. Of course, 18 are the most important because they expire at the end of April. But between our department and the Office of Grants Accounting, we will draw down all of those funds.
Thank you so much. I believe that concludes our Q&A portion of today's work session. We'll move next into public comment. So, Commissioner Wyman, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for being willing to answer these very difficult questions. These are questions that myself and several of my colleagues have had for some time. Like I mentioned before, some of us, not all of us, but some of us are kind of the new kids on the block. So we know why we ran and the concerns that our constituents brought to us, our now constituents brought to us on the campaign trail, and I think for us to be able to move forward together, we kind of had to have a stronger understanding of how we got to where we are and what opportunities are available to us to move forward together. So I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing, your insight with the committee today. With that being said, for our first public comment, we have Jeff Graham from Georgia Equality.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Dozier. And first of all, I want to thank you all for being here today. This is something that we had hoped we could have had in the past, a more vibrant conversation about this. The one thing that I do want to point out, and I think it echoes what Council President Shipman had said earlier, I hope it's not 4 months before there's another meeting, and two, I hope that we actually have the project sponsors and people living with HIV and AIDS here in this room. That is sorely lacking today. I'm personally embarrassed about it. I feel I did not do my job to make sure that those folks were here today. But I just found out about this meeting at the end of last week. And I know that may have been when it was scheduled, but I hope we can schedule more in the future, a little bit further in advance, so that they can be here. Commissioner Lemon, I think, did a remarkable job with her comments, her candor, her transparency, and that was very good. But you still need to hear from the providers themselves, and more importantly, you need to hear from people living with HIV and AIDS so that you know that frustration. We don't even know what the extent of the unmet need is. Numbers vary from 185 to 1,400. That's a pretty big range. Just 2 weeks ago, when there was a HOPWA providers meeting that was called by the HOPWA providers, not by the city of Atlanta. And we asked what the waiting list was. One of the providers said, "We think it may have dropped to 185, but we're not sure why. We're afraid that people have just given up hope and are dropping out of the system." These are people living with a chronic, life-threatening medical condition that is so important that Congress has appropriated specific federal funds to serve them, and we have all mismanaged that program so chronically that they've given up hope. So those are the folks we need to reach out to. We're happy to help build those relationships if necessary so that we really can go forward. I want to just relay the comments of one other central provider. And since they're not here to speak for themselves, I'm not going to name the specific providers. But in that same meeting 2 weeks ago, they said that they were still struggling to try to get their February 2021 reimbursement approved. So yes, there is headway that has been made. Yes, Councilmember Westmoreland, I agree with you, but I don't share all of the optimism that you had with that comment. I think we still are struggling. We have to get this reimbursement issue situated. I do believe very strongly that Commissioner Lonan is headed in the right direction, but it is incumbent upon council to be monitoring every step of the process to make sure that it happens. One of the things that Commissioner Lonan says to me all the time is hold me accountable. She said that to you today. I think we all need to take that very, very seriously so that we can't have this happen again. Councilmember Wan, you were point on with your comments about transparency and collaboration. I think if we can improve the technology and actually have a dashboard that all of us can see, that doesn't just have the chart that Commissioner Lonan presented today, which is an important chart, but it doesn't show the full story. It doesn't show how many dollars and how many agencies have submitted reimbursements that are still in the pipeline. That's something critical for us to know. And then finally, as was pointed out from Commissioner Waite's last question, this is a 29-county program. This is a 29-county problem. Unfortunately, the changes in the federal formula, it should be no surprise to anybody that we're losing $10 million this year. Congress made those changes over a decade ago. The city was warned over a decade ago to start planning for this, and everybody just ignored it, kicked the can down the road. The previous administration, their approach to it when they did start to bring providers together was, what services can we cut? I'm sorry, that's the wrong question to ask. It's how can we backfill and fill those gaps? Where can we find the additional funds? And so I've said this to the mayor's office, I'm going to say it to you. It's a 29-county problem. There's other counties. You all have colleagues in other councils. We need to be bringing people together to not just find that $10 million, but expand it. Because right now, if we're just struggling and there's a waiting list, even if it's 185, we can probably handle that. But I worry that it's closer to that 1,400, because that's the number that we keep hearing over and over and over again. And we all know that affordable housing has got to be one of the top issues that you as city council members address over the next 4 years. We've already lost so much ground on that. And so it's not just siloing HOPWA into its own separate program, it's integrating HOPWA into these larger conversations about housing affordability and making sure that you are really showing the leadership that I know, because I know a lot of you personally, I know that you are wonderful leaders. I know you can bring this together as a regional approach. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Will. We are working on a letter so that we'll have some additional information to you. But I appreciate the time today, and I look forward to working with you on the challenges ahead. But let's be clear, this reimbursement issue, when we get that resolved, that just puts us at step one of a much larger, longer, and more important process ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Graham. Next we have Will Ramirez, also with Georgia Equality. Go ahead and step to the podium, sir.
Good morning again, Council. And I really appreciate you holding this meeting today. As part of my public comments today, I want to share the preliminary letter that Jeff mentioned, and then some additional short comments afterwards. So, dear committee members, congratulations on nearing your first 100 days in office. Thank you for your diligent efforts in working to address the many issues impacting communities in Atlanta. We wish continued success in what remains of your terms in office. These comments serve as a notice and opportunity for the mayor and the city council to work together to improve the lives of your constituents living with HIV. We ask that the mayor and the city council address the 4 points that will be related in these comments. First, when you took office, there was a crisis within the city of Atlanta. The ongoing crisis within the HOPWA federal program. Recently, Commissioner of the City of Atlanta's Department of Grants and Community Development, Ms. Deborah Lunnan, has implemented a new monitoring-based system, reimbursement system, that, according to Commissioner Lunnan, promises to streamline and rectify the long-standing issue of reimbursements and payments to HOPWA service providers in Atlanta. Now, the community needs to be made aware of the progress of this new system, and the city needs to be fully transparent. Answers to questions such as, will reports be publicly available? When will they be available? What percentage of organizations have been reimbursed, and what time frame do payments represent? These answers should be expressed as a numerator, denominator, and percentage. In the past 4 months, 2 HOPWA providers in Atlanta have closed their doors to providing HOPWA services and have ended their contracts with the city. We need to do all that we can to prevent more providers from being lost. Second, more than 1,400 individuals and families are currently on a waiting list seeking HOPWA services. As Jeff mentioned, that number ranges from 185, as he mentioned, up to 1,400 or more. And the fact that we have that discrepancy, that gap, that's a problem. As we learned in early March, Congress passed the fiscal year 22 budget, funding HOPWA at around $1,415 million and falling deeply below funding the needs of persons living with HIV in Atlanta. Previously to that, advocates were asking for $600 million. We did not get that. Now, Atlanta, which will be the hardest hit city by this funding. With this woeful funding decision, Atlanta will have $10 million fewer to fund HOPWA. This is sure to exacerbate the list of people and families living with HIV and seeking HOPWA services on the city's waiting list. The commissioner has stated that the waiting list is not necessarily an issue for the grants department, and she did very well to clarify her statements both in the meeting that we had last week and today. So, this is an issue, as she said, that there's an issue for everyone to work together to fix, and that the commissioner has agreed to be a part of those efforts. The city's mismanagement of the HOPWA program has contributed to the extensive waiting list, so it must take some measure of ownership and accountability. Repairing relationships with providers and landlords will go a long way to increasing capacity by allowing more vouchers and assisting in alleviating the wait list. Will the mayor and city council commit to supporting addressing and funding solutions for the waiting list of persons and families living with HIV seeking HOPWA services. Third, and this is a person that Commissioner London did mention in her statements, Ms. Jennifer Keenan, has been appointed by the mayor in a HOPWA, as a HOPWA liaison volunteer position. Ms. Keenan has done a great job meeting with the community and providers to eliminate some of the issues that have come up in communications with the city. Unfortunately, her role as housing liaison is a voluntary one, which creates the perception of the lack of accountability. Atlanta's HOPWA crisis cannot be solved on a project basis. It requires the city to improve its contract and reimbursement systems permanently. Establishing a full-time paid position does three things: promote sustainability to alleviate issues and confidence that what is resolved is maintained, demonstrate that the city's commitment to HOPWA program issues and understanding its severity, and then demonstrate that the city takes seriously the housing needs of constituents living with HIV, who are predominantly Black and/or marginalized populations. And then lastly, persons living with HIV and using HOPWA services are vulnerable to being detrimentally impacted by housing instability. If circumstances lead individuals and families to become evicted from their homes, they face long-lasting consequences when seeking new housing. Landlords will refrain from offering housing to persons with an eviction history. HOPWA recipients shouldn't have to face these additional challenges and barriers to stable housing. An expungement of previous housing status is necessary for those individuals and families. Expungement procedures could be accomplished through a two-step process. Step one, investigating the number of individuals evicted in whole or in part due to late payments or non-payments from the city. This must be done in collaboration with HOPWA provider agencies, both current and historically funded. Step two, partner with legal aid to provide legal assistance such as expungement. This partnership must be formally documented through appropriate methods. The HOPWA program and the people it serves are facing an impending crisis, as federal funding for this program is scheduled to be reduced by as much as 40% in the coming years due to changes in the federal funding formula approved by Congress in 2018. Additionally, Congress passing of the fiscal year 22 appropriations budget with the funding of HOPWA at $450 million leaves Atlanta EMA with a loss of $10 million. Because of the ongoing challenges with the management of the current program, the City of Atlanta has wasted valuable time over the past 5 years to prepare for this eventuality. Therefore, we encourage the Office of the Mayor and the members of the City Council to work together to ensure that these 4 points are met. There's much to celebrate with the progress that has been made so far with the leadership of Commissioner London and the Department of Grants and Community Development, and we welcome the opportunity to work closely with you to ensure promises made before getting elected are kept and these 4 points are addressed. As for my short comments, I'll keep them really, really short. I just wanted to add that in all the conversations that we have and pertaining this program, we often, one often thing that's missing from these conversations and the way that the city is treating the situation is that there is little to no mention of the individuals living with HIV who are impacted. It feels that the city's view of this is a budget compliance issue, and the folks to remedy with are the project sponsors, not the folks living with HIV. So I think it's important for us to remember that the people impacted are the ones that need to be helped here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ramirez. And thank you as well, Mr. Graham. I appreciate the both of you all speaking today. That concludes our public comment portion. Before we wrap up for today, I do want to say that you both have definitely been heard. And as we look to get another meeting on the calendar, we will do our damnedest to make sure that we have more stakeholders in the room with us. I will say that at least for myself and a few of my other colleagues, we wanted to make sure that we met as soon as we can to try to address this issue, and I think what got lost in that was the process, the deliberate process to make sure all voices are at the table, all voices are heard. So we'll definitely work on that. Separately, I do want to let the public know that the Department of Grants and Community Development will be back before the Community Development Human Services Committee for their quarterly presentation. And Commissioner Lyon will probably have some questions for you at that juncture as far as where things are with the reimbursements and with the payments. That date is scheduled for May 10th. I think it's when you're scheduled to go back before the committee. And then separately, we'll look to reconvene this body, this group, these stakeholders to talk specifically about where things are as well. So more to follow on when that will be. But thank you all for coming, for attending, for presenting, for sharing your thoughts and your concerns. Thank you to my colleagues for the phenomenal questions. And that concludes our work session for today, and I look forward to working with you all to get final resolution on this very important issue. Thank you so much.